It's Friday, August 5th, 2022. My name is Ashton Ellett. I'm here with a Russell Oral History documentary interview with Mr. Tom Clements. Mr. Clements is a native of Savannah, Georgia. He earned his bachelor's degree from Emory University in Atlanta and a master's degree in forest resources from the University of Georgia. During his time in Athens, he founded Athenians for Clean Energy. After graduation, he worked for the U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Office of Surface Mining before transitioning into a variety of positions with organizations such as Greenpeace, the Nuclear Control Institute, the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, Friends of the Earth, the South Carolina chapter of the Sierra Club, and most recently, the Savannah River Site Watch. In the world of politics, he helped manage the congressional campaign of U.S. Representative Doug Bernard, and in 2010, he was the Green Party's nominee for U.S. Senate. Mr. Clements, Tom, thank you so much for making the trip to Athens to talk about your work experience, your life experience, and your time around politics and public policy. Thank you very much.
Glad to do this. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. Great to be here on a Friday. Great way to cap the week. So I wonder, tell me a little bit about your childhood and upbringing. You come from a very well-established Georgia family. Grew up in Savannah, is that right?
Well, I tell people I am from Savannah.
Okay.
I was born in Savannah, so I guess you could say I'm a Savannah native, but actually we lived out in the country.
Okay.
In Claxton, Georgia.
The fruitcakes.
The fruitcake capital, at least at some point. So my parents were educators,
Okay.
both in Claxton, and then later my father was principal of the high school in Claxton, and my mother was a teacher, and then they moved to Waynesboro, Georgia after Claxton, also when I was a child, and then to Canton, Georgia, north of Atlanta, which has become a suburb.
Oh, yeah,
more or
absolutely.
less. But so I grew up in a household that the focus was on education.
Right.
And I think that was instilled in my parents, who were both from rural Georgia, the value of education. My mother was from a farming family, which moved from Monroe County, Georgia, Forsyth, Georgia,
Right.
south of Atlanta.
Yeah.
When the boll weevil hit, they were cotton farmers, and they moved to near Dublin, Georgia, right on the outskirts of Dublin. So I spent a lot of time on the farm, my grandfather's farm and then uncle's farm. So rural Georgia in many ways. My father was from Rockmart, Georgia, Slate area near Rome, south of Chattanooga, Tennessee. So there, growing up and living in rural Georgia really was instilled in me, but I didn't realize it until later years. And I can talk about it a little bit more, but my parents, and this was a revelation later, but it was part of my youth, they were Rosenwald scholars, which was, I forget his first name right now, one of the founders of Sears Roebuck, who built the
Julius Rosenwald.
Yeah, who helped build the Rosenwald schools for African American neglected kids around the South. And there's still a good many of those left, though a lot of them have fallen down. Anyway,
Right.
they met because they were Rosenwald scholars, and the pledge was to go back and teach in the rural South, in Georgia. So all of that, I mean, the pieces came together many decades later, where I realized how they had grown up and gotten their education. And they met at University of Georgia as Rosenwald scholars. And there's a little bit written about that, and you may have I think you have some stuff at the archives about it, but
Governor Gene Talmadge was not a fan of the
Not a
Rosenwald
fan, and
fund.
actually this impacted me, although I didn't know it until later, but they went over and protested the firing of Dean Cocking, I think it
Walter
was,
Cocking.
at the education school.
So
And
1940, 41.
Yeah, they're 40, 41, then my father joined the Navy in World War II, and they moved to Norfolk and then Chicago, where my father was at the Naval Pier.
Oh, yeah.
But the fact that I learned they had protested in Atlanta against the firing of Dean Cocking for having had a African American on the stage at the University of Georgia, at some event of the education school, I realized that they had instilled all that in me. So when I became the guy that was, out protesting or affirming, something, I found out that they had done that back in, 1940 or so, and it just like, wow.
Chip off the old block.
Maybe it turns out, and I didn't really know it, but I grew up, with their guidance, and they were stalwarts in the Methodist Church, which also had an influence, though I may have changed path to a big degree. But so I grew up in, before coming to Decatur, at DeKalb County, Atlanta, when I was in the second grade. And despite there being educators, I really couldn't read or write well going into the second grade. So I got some special treatment by Ms. Gardner at Fernbank Elementary School here in DeKalb County, where she whipped me in line. And my parents made sure that I made up for lost time in a very poor public school in Canton. And it was why they moved to Atlanta. So their three children, my two sisters, and me, Judy and Kathy, would get a better education.
So you grew up in Decatur, East Atlanta area?
Well,
Fernbank is
right
in there.
Near the Atlanta line, but it's in DeKalb County, right off Ponce de Leon.
Yep.
Quarter mile off Ponce de Leon going into downtown Atlanta. So
that's how we know you're a native Georgian, is that you can pronounce it correctly.
You don't say Ponce de Leon.
No, Ponce de Leon, no.
And people, when I say Ponce de Leon, they look at me like, what?
Oh.
And I speak Spanish, so I don't even blink an eye.
Right.
But, so I grew up in the DeKalb County school system. My mother taught at Druid Hills High School, and
Right.
I later attended Druid Hills High School. So it was a little strange having my mother there. But
Understandable. My daughter is in the same grade school that my wife teaches in, but not in the same class.
Yeah, not my sister. One of my sisters had my mother. She was the head of the math department. And let me just add one more thing. Yeah. I guess under the influence of my father, I was a Cub Scout and then a Boy Scout.
Okay.
So I learned a lot about the environment, and that really became very important in my life. I was an Eagle Scout. Some people think that's important, but I don't think it marked me that much. But I learned a lot about the outdoors. We camped and hiked quite a bit from Troop 18 at Glen Memorial Methodist Church, which is right on the Emory campus. So I think that's where my environmental activism came from, is actually from the Boy Scouts.
Interesting. So you stayed close to home when you went to college, going to Emory University.
Well, I actually had a choice of places distant, and I went to Center College, C-E-N-T-R-E.
Owensboro?
In Danville,
Kentucky, that's right.
And there was only like 800 students, but after about a year and a half, I left and came back here to Emory and graduated from Emory.
What did you study as an undergrad?
History.
Okay, good man.
And, but towards the end of that, I knew that if I was going to go on to grad school, I was going to go in biology or environmental sciences. So I'd already decided just to get a degree, and then I could make up for some lost time in grad school. And I came to Georgia and went to the School of Forest Resources. And the grad program was 2 years, but I had to make up a year of classes I didn't have.
Right.
So it took me 3 years to finish that master's degree in forest resources, and I think the name of the school has changed now.
Yeah, I think is it the Warnell School of Forestry?
Forestry, and it could be in natural resources, I'm not sure.
My parents studied forestry in grad school at Southern Illinois University.
And I was there at a time when there was anti-environmental sentiment. It was timber production. And there was a wildlife
Right, you're from South
division.
Georgia, so you know
Tree
all about
farms
it.
was the emphasis, and now it was starting to change, and they didn't like some of my environmental attitudes.
They being?
The professors and the administration, and I didn't really buckle in pushing environmental stuff with the professors.
Right.
And so made the best of it, and thankfully they let me They let me shape my degree.
Okay.
They let me take classes in various parts of the university because they knew that they weren't going to channel me into being a timber beast, as we called it. So they let me take classes in environmental design and environmental law, in horticulture and soils. So the core was in the School of Forest Resources, but I got to add a lot of stuff, and they kind of let me do that. And I'm very appreciative I was able to shape my environmental understanding and consciousness because they accommodated me.
This betrays my own ignorance, but was forestry and plant and soil science, were those separate departments?
Yes.
Okay.
And the Institute of Ecology was separate.
Right.
And the building at that time, at least, I'm not sure now, was pretty much adjacent.
I think that's the Odom School.
Yeah,
now.
the Odom, yes, he founded that Institute of Ecology, as I remember. So I had a bunch of friends there, and I took classes in the Institute of Ecology, but many professors in Forest Resources didn't like their more holistic approach, but I just plowed ahead. And the Institute of Ecology is a real resource for the university here, and I've encountered it later in my career because they operate the Savannah River Ecology Lab at the Savannah River site, which was the Savannah River plant at that time. So I had great influence from all this academic study of environmental things. And
that raises the question, you come to University of Georgia and you enroll in forest resources, but it sounds like culturally, outlook, perspective-wise, ecology, School of Ecology may have been more, in line with your thinking. Why did you choose to remain in forest resources as opposed to, say, ecology or plant soil science or some of the other things that you studied?
it's a great question. I'm not quite sure, but I thought, okay, forest resources, this is going to be all-encompassing of environmental impacts and environmental things, when it turned out it was more timber production oriented.
Okay.
And
so that was something you learned.
I learned when I got in, and
Yeah.
I was already accepted and in it.
Gotcha.
So I just continued, and I was able to shape it to my interests. Although they had to bend more than they wanted to, I think, but they did. And the times were a-changing back in, this was in the 70s, so the 60s attitude of, at least of the young people, being more culturally and politically involved in environmental awareness.
Right.
Earth Day, I think in 1970, that really influenced me, but I carried that forward. So looking back, was it an error to have come to an institute that didn't really fit as much? Possibly, but I made it fit.
Sure.
And I was really more into the Institute of Ecology, but the problem there was they wanted more people who are going to be doctorates and doing their scientific studies in ecology, which was great, but I was kind of training myself more to be politically and involved in environmental issues.
So is this the time where you help organize Athenians for Clean Energy during your time at UGA?
Yes. So when I was in grad school, and I graduated in '77, so some of this was ending.
Sure.
And I graduated from Emory in '73, and I took almost a year off, and then had 3 years in grad school. We formed a group because, in large part, because there was a proposal to ship spent nuclear fuel,
Okay.
highly radioactive spent nuclear fuel from nuclear power plants over to a site adjacent to Savannah River site in South Carolina near Barnwell to reprocess that material to remove plutonium to use as nuclear fuel. And our initial work against it, and we founded this group, Athenians for Clean Energy, which was focused on that, but also pushing for clean energy efficiency, conservation, and solar power, even way back then.
Sure.
And there was a following and a pretty good membership. We had monthly programs, but we were also concerned about that shipment of spent nuclear fuel to this plant, that the government hadn't made a final decision if it was going to operate or not, the federal government.
Right.
And they constructed this reprocessing plant on land that had been purchased from Department of Energy. Then it may have been Atomic Energy Commission, and then ERDA, Energy Research and Development Agency. Then it became Department of Energy. And we got the city council, maybe county council, to not oppose it, but to express concern about these shipments
Sure.
that we were concerned about. And we were concerned about the waste that would have been created on the other end, plus separating plutonium. So it was that point I really didn't realize that I was concerned about the environmental impacts of reprocessing, which I really worked on my whole career.
Right.
And the separation of plutonium, which is a nuclear weapons material.
Right.
So it turned out later that a lot of my work was against use of plutonium as a nuclear fuel in order to keep a nuclear weapons material out of commerce. So the founding of Athenians for Clean Energy and also working with the Sierra Club group on campus, a lot of that effort has come through until today, 2022.
So I think currently the view of Athens is that it's incredibly progressive, very, very forward-thinking in terms of public policy issues and politics. Some people jokingly refer to it as the People's Republic of Athens, things like that. Was that the case in the 1970s? Was that what Athens was like, how you found it when you were confronting issues like transportation of nuclear waste or clean energy solutions, things like that?
I think there was a lot of activism and involvement. There were activities, protests, and other things on other social, cultural, environmental issues. And actually, on my experience related to where I live now, Columbia, South Carolina, I think there was more activism back then and concern than there is now. I'm very concerned that the culture as a whole, and particularly young people, they may be involved in climate change, but on a lot of the other stuff, I don't see as much engagement as I felt and saw and participated in back then. But I realized Athens was a progressive place, and being close to Atlanta, we worked a lot with folks in Atlanta.
I mean, that was actually the very last question I had on my my question list here was, are you more hopeful now than you were then after your lifetime of experience? But in that case, why do you think there was such you've mentioned in our previous meetings and lunches before, numerous people that you met here in Athens and were involved and have gone on to careers in public service or activism. Deb Shepard, for example, down on the coast. Why do you think you were able to find that sort of community in Athens, and who were some of those folks, and have you stayed in touch with them over the years?
Well, that may be the most important part, the question, because why do we do what we do, and what were the influences?
Yeah. And
I think at that time, the environmental movement,
right,
in its form at that date, with a lot of prehistory, was kind of born into the culture, and it exploded. And my peers felt that, so we felt like we're involved in a budding environmental movement,
right,
and cultural awakening on a lot of things, on women's issues and civil rights and other things. And it turned out that a lot of us had decided that if we got educated on environmental or other issues, that we could play maybe a stronger role if we had some credentials and more knowledge.
Sure.
So those of us who were concerned about environment and more women's issues too, and peace and justice in general.
Right.
Because there were a lot of things related to South Africa and Central America that were going on. And my awakening about Central America later brought me to join the Peace Corps and learn Spanish. But there was a real community, and particularly people from the Institute of Ecology, and people wouldn't know them, but some good friends. One guy was Richard Lawrence, who became a leading riparian forest along streams and rivers. And he had a long career with the Agricultural Research Service and Environmental Protection Agency. Another guy, Ole Hendrickson, became a stalwart in the Canadian, I forget what you call it, forest resources of the state national government. You mentioned Deborah Shepard, who studied horticulture when she was not in the Institute of Ecology or Forest Resources, became the leader of the Altamont Riverkeeper group, and when I'm speaking, she has a native plant nursery. So there were a lot of other people. The guy that I mentioned I saw today, Gary Appleson, became a leader in a group in Florida to protect sea turtles, and that group has been invaluable in protecting the beaches and nesting of sea turtles in some areas of Central America, but also Florida. So that's an example. So many of us went out to do public service and not, just self-enrichment.
Right, right. So, you've built up this, you've worked on your activism, developed this over your time at UGA. What led you then to the U.S. Forest Service? Was that where you landed after graduation? Walk me through the timeline of Tom Clements' professional career.
Well, because I had been trained more in environmental science, even though it was in the School of Forest Resources, I felt I should get a job in that area. And somehow or another, I ended up more working on nuclear issues and nuclear non-proliferation. But I applied for federal government jobs, and I remember getting the call. And I guess I'd applied for it, but I got a job with what was then called the Office of Surface Mining of the federal government to do enforcement of the Surface Mining Act that regulated coal mining. And I had to get them to explain, to give me a pitch that would help the environment, because the coal mining was so destructive.
Oh, sure.
And this was enforcing the regulations on coal mining. I ended up accepting the job in around 1978, I guess, after I graduated. And I forget what I was doing for 6 or 8 months or a year. But anyway, I ended up moving to Hazard, Kentucky. And Hazard, Kentucky, at the time of this interview, has had major flooding. And because the towns are built along the rivers and valleys, and there's a lot of strip mine runoff that's funneled down through these rivers. So for about a year and a half, I was the guy that would go up to coal strip mines of all sorts. Mountaintop removal, where they just blow the whole top of the mountain off.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
Or where they would not blow the top of the mountain off, but cut vertical cliffs into the top of the mountain where there was a big coal seam from a few feet to 5-6 feet or something. Then they would bore into that from the flat land that was created when they removed all that. So they wouldn't remove the whole mountain. So it was regulated how they would take that spoil that was removed, and they had to put it in another place and then somehow restore the contour. But it was totally abused. And I went on a lot of mines, and there were illegal activity going on, and they would just push all the dirt over the side of the mountains, like down into the creeks. And the rivers up there flow gray because of the coal spoil and the coal waste runoff. So I found out pretty quick that the federal government was not going to support me, and I closed down mines. But they would...
What was the reaction from the mining companies?
Oh, they would basically laugh. I don't think it really happened. I would say you got to stop mining until you comply with these laws and regulations, and give them the list, give them the paper, And the miners that kind of just smiled and agreed rather than ones that got confrontational. And I got to be where, after I was training, I was on my own. And frankly, it was a bit of a dangerous situation. And I remember one time a guy said, I'm not going to do anything. If you close this mine down because we're not complying, I'm not going to do anything to you. But all these men here, they all got guns. And I was like, okay. And it was basically a threat. And it was always implied. And I found out how that law was a paper tiger. And we didn't have backup from the administrators of the Office of Surface Mining or the lawyers. And we would go before administrative law judges with evidence. And they basically would side with the coal companies. And there were a lot of illegal mines going on, but for a house site, you could flatten a certain area, like a couple of acres.
Okay.
But they would blow the whole top of the mountain off and say, oh, this is a house for my grandmother. And I remember one guy put a little shack, not a shack, but a prefab house about 10 by 20 feet on there and said, this is a house for my grandmother. And it's like,
I'm sorry.
Junior
It's not
Combs,
funny, but
Mr. Combs, this is no house for your grandmother. Oh, yeah, it is. You prove it isn't. And Junior Combs, I remember encountering him later on a back road going from one of his illegal operations. And I was with another miner because we wouldn't go up there alone. And we sighted him and we were trying to find him to give him the papers or put him at his house. And he blocked us in on this backwoods road. And I remember him looking into the driver's side, and I was on the passenger side. And he reached into his pocket, and I thought it was kind of flopping, and I thought he maybe had a pistol in there. And I remember him saying to this day, I hate to kill you boys. And I was going, okay, I can jump out the door, but if I do that, am I a coward because he's going to shoot my colleague in the head and run down the side of the mountain? I think I can outmaneuver Junior Combs. And right when something was about to come down, his nose exploded with blood. His blood pressure was so high. He was bleeding down the front of his shirt. And I'm going, oh my gosh, he's a desperate man who doesn't want to be regulated. He's used to working as a rogue. And that's when he said, I don't want to kill you boys. And I was thinking about what to do and abandoning my colleague. And right at that minute, a Jeep pulls up behind us out of the woods. And it turns out it was the miners that inspect the underground mines. So they're about 10 yards behind us. And Junior Combs is over the top angry. And he backed off, took his hands out of his pocket. And we went back to talk to these guys. And I told them this guy is, he's getting, he's threatening us. And they waited. And we were able to leave. But that was kind of the pall hanging over this kind of work because there was not much support. Of course, we went back and reported it and wrote it up. And
right.
Nothing really happened. Junior Combs did get citations in federal court, but I decided I didn't want to get shot in the head for a law that I didn't really think was working well. So I quit that job, I don't know, middle of 1981 or something. And my parents were quite happy because they didn't want me killed up in Hazard, Kentucky.
Understandable.
And I felt a little bit of a failure, but I couldn't take on the failure of the law, which had been a hard-fought law to regulate coal strip mining. And I left and came back to Athens. So that was one job I had. So that was my experience working on environmental enforcement.
So, but you came back to Athens, not Atlanta, or
no, because I had friends here, and I didn't quite know what to do. But I ended up working in carpentry for several years while I was kind of still looking for work. But I'm glad I did that because I learned a lot of skills.
Sure.
But we still had that group, Athenians for Clean Energy, and we're doing a host of programs under that banner.
Right.
And then my interest in Central America, Nicaragua, and other countries grew. And I basically worked carpentry for 5 years before I left and went into the Peace Corps.
Yeah, tell me about that experience. Peace Corps. Again, this is probably a misconception, but most people I think of it being in the Peace Corps are either straight out of college young folks or like a Miss Lillian Carter, something like that. Tell me about how you got interested in it, how you ended up in Central America, and your experiences there, what you were doing.
Well, I was an older member of our group, and I still wanted to do things related to forest resources. And so I entered a program, a forestry program in Costa Rica. I remember when I got the call offering to go to Costa Rica, which I didn't know much about. And so half the people in my group were in forestry and half of them were in environmental education. It was a small group of about 14 people. So from 86 to 88, and I ended up working at a seed bank for the Costa Rican Forest Service, actually near San Jose, the capital, which is now a suburb where we used to be in the country. So that really formed a lot of my interest in international environmental issues and forestry and environmental protection, and that's where I learned to speak Spanish.
I was going to ask, you said you were fluent in Spanish. I wondered if you
Yes.
Immersion is always the easiest way to learn.
And it was difficult for me to be, I was isolated, but I still here, almost 40 years later, have friends in Costa Rica, and all of that Peace Corps group, minus one person who died as a inspector on a fishing boat off Alaska when the boat sank.
Yeah.
We're all still in touch.
That's
and
great.
Every one of those people went on to work in some kind of environmental related work, whether it was the Forest Service, the National Park Service,
right,
foreign aid type things, but they all worked in environmental stuff. So I was 10 years older than them, and they regarded me as the older guy who...
Which is really not that old when you think back to it, but yeah.
No, it wasn't at all, and they realize that now. But so that helped underpin a lot of my interest in international environmental issues and Spanish, which later came to be used in some other work.
So you started Greenpeace International when?
Pretty much right when I came back from Peace Corps. Right after that.
How does one sign up for a paying gig with Greenpeace?
Well, it wasn't really a choice, and that was to work on the Savannah River site on nuclear issues. But when we had Athenians for Clean Energy, we had worked on nuclear waste issues at the big secret nuclear bomb plant, Savannah River site. Nobody knew anything about it. Located right across the Georgia border, across from the Savannah River, and we participated through Athenians for Clean Energy and otherwise in demonstrations at the site, and we protested the shipment of spent nuclear fuel, to a facility right by there, and I actually got arrested protesting this reprocessing plant. We trespassed, and there were thousands of people who went to a big protest over there against that facility, and it was adjacent to the bomb plant, as it was called, and nobody really knew much about it. But then I learned that that's where they produced nuclear weapons materials, mainly plutonium for nuclear weapons, and there was a massive amount of high-level waste at the site. So I learned about that facility in the 1970s, and we worked on it through Athenians for Clean Energy in the 80s while I was a carpenter. But so that was basically why I got a job with Greenpeace, because they were hiring somebody to focus on policies of the U.S. Department of Energy and policies specifically related to the Savannah River site. So I had experience as a volunteer. So in 1989, I got hired by Greenpeace U.S., and and the job was in Columbia, South Carolina. So I moved to Columbia, South Carolina just for that job.
I see.
And we had a big campaign against restarting one of the old nuclear reactors there called the K reactor that was going to produce tritium gas that goes into all nuclear weapons.
Is that heavy water?
Well, it was heavy water reactors, and there are 5 reactors that produce tritium gas for nuclear weapons and plutonium. So we fought the restart of that reactor and basically won. And then after a year and a half, went with Greenpeace International, based out of Amsterdam. But I went to Atlanta because the office in Columbia was so small.
Sure.
And then after maybe 2 years in Atlanta, I moved to Washington, D.C. to work for Greenpeace International. But my bosses were in Amsterdam.
Okay.
So that opened my eyes to a lot of stuff internationally, and worked on a lot of international nuclear issues, including nuclear weapons stuff and nuclear nonproliferation and nuclear waste and shipment of spent nuclear fuel and plutonium. And that's where I more got aware of and involved in work against international reprocessing plants that's military and civilian that separate plutonium that can be used in nuclear weapons. So kind of the theme became working against proliferation.
Right.
But we had also done campaigning, as I'll call it, against Georgia Power's construction of 2 nuclear reactors at Plant Vogtle.
Okay.
And they constructed those reactors, and I think the cost was estimated to be $1 billion, and it ended up being $10 billion, way back then in the 80s. And what do we see a repeat?
Reactors 3 and 4.
3 units, and the fuel may be loaded in one of them.
I saw the NRC just gave
Yes,
the
approved
go-ahead
that.
of fuel number 3.
And the cost on those reactors in current dollars is like $35 billion, and way behind schedule. And they basically have killed nuclear power in the United States of these large reactors. And I opposed those, and we can talk about this in South Carolina, mainly from the diversion of resources into nuclear power at the time when there was no analysis of investing in conservation and efficiency in solar power. And it's still not happening enough. But that was one of the things we worked again as well. But I got diverted, I would say, from working on purely environmental impact stuff into working on the environmental impact of nuclear issues and nuclear nonproliferation and nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And I really...
It sounds very much like what Sam Nunn, after he left office with the Nuclear Threat Initiative.
Yeah, so I was
Senator Lugar
kind of connected to that stuff.
Okay.
Locke Johnson was a professor here,
Yes,
got
absolutely.
involved with some of the activities he was working on. I got involved in the nuclear weapons freeze. In 1980, when I moved back to Athens, the nuclear weapons freeze, to freeze the level of nuclear weapons and comply with a nuclear nonproliferation treaty to reduce nuclear weapons. And Linda Chafin and I, who is known by the archives, we founded the Northeast Georgia Campaign for a Nuclear Weapons Freeze. And that group was very dynamic. We had a lot of programs, big attendance that I don't think we could get now, even though the threat of nuclear weapons is much now and people don't really know it. And Dean Rusk, who was affiliated with the University of Georgia, tried to oppose us. And we turned out a ton of people at a law school event to support the nuclear weapons freeze. We got the county and maybe the city government to support our efforts. So I got more deeply involved into nuclear weapons and nuclear nonproliferation, even though my background was more environmental science. But it was more following along with where I was being drawn and pushed, where I kind of left the pure environmental area, and in some ways I wish I'd stuck with it, but it became part of my career later. Nobody was doing it to the degree I was, so I kind of picked up the torch and worked on these things because nobody else was following. And I had the blessing of my parents and family, and I was lucky enough to I was in conflict with some cultural stuff and religious beliefs. But on the environmental area, they were supportive, and they also learned a lot as I was working on these things. But I, in many ways, wish I'd worked on pure environmental issues
Right.
more than just nuclear stuff. But I was responding to what I thought was being demanded of me.
Right. Well, and one thing I wanted to talk about or ask you about, you said you were your bosses once you went to Greenpeace International were in Amsterdam. Were there differences in priorities and outlook from anti-nuclear activists in Europe as opposed to the United States? The Green movement in the 1980s, the anti, obviously with the anti-ballistic missile movement, the placement of nuclear weapons on continental Europe during the Cold War, triggered that growth of the Green movement in Germany, France, lesser extent Britain because of Thatcher's influence. But were there differences? How did you negotiate? How did you negotiate that sort of international workplace? Stuff like that.
Well, I can tell you, it was an eye-opening experience to be exposed to people working all around the world in environmental issues, but in this case, nuclear stuff. And a lot of the European activism was born out of post-World War political climate,
Right.
where the U.S. and Germany helped set up their representative government, where it's more parliamentarian.
Right.
And it's proportional representation. So the Green Party, for example, had more pull, and it certainly does here in 2022.
It's in government.
I mean, it's continued to grow. We didn't have that in the U.S. with a two-party system. And I'm a great believer in the parliamentarian system where there's proportional representation, because those of us who are the 20% or whatever never get proper representation, and those people had it, and they had power. And Greenpeace in this case and other environmental groups had some political power. And I saw that, and it blew my mind.
Right.
And they were totally willing to work with people from the United States because they know how important politically and culturally the United States was. But I'm talking about working with groups in Australia, Japan, to a lesser degree, places like Turkey. There was in South Africa. But we were able to bring the force of all these Greenpeace offices, particularly in North Europe, Germany, Belgium, Great Britain, Netherlands in particular. I mean, it was a cultural force to be reckoned with in Europe, a political force as well. And to be hooked in with that and to plan international campaigns, and a lot of the work ended up being against international nuclear waste trade and reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel, shipment of nuclear fuel from Japan. And I worked with colleagues from Greenpeace Russia, who later became under great...
Greenpeace, I did not know Greenpeace had a footprint.
And they were really constrained by the government, and particularly constrained if they were getting outside resources. So learning about all this, it was constant learning. And I realized what a blessing it was for me to have my mind just opened up. And I went to Russia on a couple occasions, went to Ukraine and Chernobyl, I think 1995.
Oh, wow.
Not too long after the wall fell, but it was part of our commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the Chernobyl accident. And working with these people, I mean, they had an attitude, we can change things. And we don't let the government get in our way or cultural institutions. We don't have that attitude here. And I think it was because of, they realized they had to get their act together after World War II and set up institutions that really helped shape beliefs and politics. And I find people who have not had that experience I did with Greenpeace International, I mean, it was such an experience. And I left Greenpeace, I left for a few years and then came back and finally left in 2006. And I'm still in touch with a lot of those people. And right now in 2022, for example, if I can speak about this, they just had an expedition to go to Chernobyl to monitor the reporting of the International Atomic Energy Agency that the Russian excavation of trenches and placement of mines around the Chernobyl site and running a bunch of tanks through the site and churning up the radiation, which I got exposed to when we visited there. It was a little scary.
Sure.
They went in and did a survey of how much radiation in there. It's some of the very same people I worked with 15 and 20 years ago who are still dedicated to the cultural and political, environmental involvement on these issues. And they still turn to me as kind of the main ones in the United States, because Greenpeace stopped working on nuclear issues in the United States maybe 10 years ago. And that's one of the reasons I later went to Friends of the Earth.
Sure.
But my roots in international nuclear work via Greenpeace, it's still very strong, right up to my retirement, which is kind of happening now. And I'm still in touch with those guys, and mostly guys, but some women. And I was on some of the Greenpeace ships, and it was just amazing personal experience that few others have. So I was very blessed with that.
Well, you were talking about Chernobyl, and I can remember, I mean, obviously this was just a few months ago, when the Russians invaded Ukraine and seized the Chernobyl site. There was an initial panic over what could possibly happen, because if the dome was ruptured, or the scientists weren't allowed to maintain.
There was no cooling of the fuel, or they ruptured the container some of the fuel is in. And,
right. And what I realized was, there was just a slight bit of panic about that, but that was obviously something that was just a permanent, or not permanent, an ever-present concern, especially in the Cold War, of nuclear weapons, nuclear accidents like Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, that you were talking about the interest and concern that people of my generation, Robert's generation, younger generations even don't necessarily have, that you and your friends and colleagues had in the 1970s. That just, there's a disconnect between the generations of the concerns about nuclear weapons, energy, that we just haven't grown up with in the way that your lived experience is informed differently.
Being in South Carolina, I find there's not much activism on any nuclear issue at all right now in 2022. So I think there is a big disconnect, with not only with younger people, but most people. And the Ukraine situation now, I mean, we can't look into the future and know what's going to happen, but the Chernobyl plant there, I've stood and looked at the temporary dome over the Chernobyl plant.
Which has to be an eerie experience.
And somebody said, hey, what's the radiation level here? And we pulled out our Geiger counters, and the thing was, it was way up on the scale. And it's like, let's get the heck out of here. We were on a tour that was kind of a charade led by, I guess, Ukrainian nuclear agency, where they didn't have any protection. We had little white coats on and little plastic boots that didn't fit. It was a joke. And we're standing there, get irradiated, and we drove down the road, and the Geiger counters would peak up driving on the road. And we were told it was where they dropped waste that you see pictures of guys shoveling stuff off the roof of the reactors.
Right.
And they had dropped this stuff when they were taking it to the burial ground. And we went into one of the facilities where they had exposed all the vehicles, trucks, fire trucks, cars, Jeeps, any kind of transport vehicle you could think of. And there was another place where they parked the helicopters that were dropping boron and water on when the fire was going on. But we went into the place, there were tracked vehicles, vehicles with wheels, and I remember underneath, we pulled into this area, and underneath the mud guard, there was some dirt. And we said, that is probably dirt that's been there almost 10 years that got picked up along that road or something. So we stick our Geiger counters on there, and it's off the scale. And we're going, I think we need to get out of here. And why didn't they tell us we were going to be exposed being in this area where all the vehicles are parked. And I think they buried all those vehicles later. So my experience at Chernobyl was there's hot spots all over the place. And when I heard in 2022 that the Russians were rolling tanks and vehicles over the roads, probably that I had been on,
Sure. Yeah.
and I knew there were hot spots and the fallout, I met the head woman who came to Columbia, South Carolina in 2016, 30th anniversary. And we'd had a preparatory meeting the year before in Europe, and she was the one who mapped with a team, if I can go on about
Yeah,
this.
oh, absolutely. This
If
is
you see the
fascinating.
plume of radiation from the reactors that goes downwind into northern Europe,
Right.
bright red, red, yellow, bright yellow, yellow, greener, all the way into, towards Scandinavia. She was the one who, mostly around the Chernobyl site and the immediate high levels into Belarus, mapped that. She was Russian, she got ordered to go there and lead a team, 10 or 12 people. So they went all over the place mapping the intensity of the radiation. So, and the last I heard of her a few years ago, when she came, she had scars from having thyroid cancer. She told me, or a colleague did in English, also Russian, who worked against Russian reprocessing at one of these international reprocessing plants at Mayak. All of her team had died. Just like all the guys who were shoveling the waste off the top of the reactor, the liquidators, they all died. So when the Russians invaded and went into the Chernobyl site with all their vehicles, all I can think of, they're driving right through that plume of the fallout into the red forest, down the roads we went down, and I've only been there once. And there's a guy, Tim Mousseau at the University of South Carolina, who's been there dozens of times doing research on impact to wildlife and birds of low-level radiation.
Right.
And he's in touch with Greenpeace now when they went in 2022. And he had a research lab over there that the Russians destroyed. And it's like, what are they doing? They have no clue. And so Greenpeace went in to try to document the International Atomic Agency, which is all an enabler rather than they don't really particularly regulate, but they put out guidelines. So all of this is very present now with the Russians in Ukraine, and also another nuclear plant, Zaporizhia, that is the largest nuclear complex of 6 operating reactors in Europe. So I may have questions about nuclear waste production, the safety of nuclear reactor operation, but now you've got to think about what happens if somebody shoots a missile into an operating nuclear power plant in a war zone. And can a peaceful zone become a war zone pretty quickly? In this case, maybe it was a lingering war zone. So I think about all this stuff right now as the expansion of nuclear power into areas that may be politically unstable.
Right.
There's so much more you got to think about than the design and safety. And I saw all the tracer rockets and stuff being fired at the administration building and outbuildings at Zaporizhia, I don't know, back in April or 2022. And you just think, oh my God, if they breach containment and breach the reactor, that's a meltdown. And they've got tons of spent nuclear fuel. If they blow a hole in the side of the spent nuclear fuel or eliminate the cooling water. So there's so much more, and people weren't thinking about it so much. The media did raise the alarm, but what are the Russians doing? Totally irresponsible. And people at Greenpeace put out, updates and alerts about what was happening at that nuclear site. Very alarming stuff.
Well, and at the same time, you have the obvious sort of emergent concerns of rounds, missiles, explosives around the nuclear power plants in Ukraine. But at the same time, you have, for lack of a better word, blackmail from the Russian government of energy, namely natural gas, oil, to Western Europe through the Nord Stream pipeline. And there was some now questioning questioning among Western European governments about, especially Germany, for example, now that the Green Party is in the governing coalition with the SPD and the Free Democrats, of shutting down coal-fired power plants, not constructing any more nuclear power plants. Same in France. Do you think there's going to be a longer-term reassessment of shifting away from nuclear power, or shifting away from non-renewables like coal, natural gas, oil, because of the geopolitical concerns of being at the mercy of a Russian government, whether it's a Vladimir Putin-led Russian government, or what comes after Vladimir Putin,
or at the mercy of anybody that's got extractive fossil fuels.
State, I suppose.
So I don't have the answers, and I don't really necessarily want to get into it because I'm not working directly on it so much. But the situation with Russia and natural gas to Germany and other countries, and the status of coal-fired power plants and nuclear power plants. You know, the good part of this crisis with Russia and the gas supply and what happens with generation stations in Europe or the United States, it's really making us assess all this. And is the dream of, you know, efficient society run off renewable energy with the population that we have and the resource consumption, is that possible? And this is causing some deeper thinking. And how long are these fuels going to last? And can we switch over? Is solar possible? And I think to a much larger degree than it is now. But that's a good part of the situation with Russia. It's making us think more deeply. You know, I really don't know if we can convert and lessen climate change impacts and resource extraction impacts, but it's kind of frightening to think what could happen. And I joke with some German friends, well, I guess you're going to be eating in the dark if you can, you know, find your food supply, and you got to get used to it, kind of thing. And what's going to happen?
Some gallows humor there.
Yeah, seriously. And we have the luxury of having, you know, natural gas and coal and stuff in the United States, but there's a cost for all this that people don't think enough about. And I have just been in contact with a group in Ukraine called Eco Action, and the Westinghouse company, which is which the reactor designs are Plant Vogtle, and they had the failed project in South Carolina for 2 big nuclear reactors that I was heavily involved in. Westinghouse wants to build reactors, I think 6 reactors in Ukraine. And nobody is telling them of the experience that Georgia and South Carolina have had of the massive cost overruns. And they can't afford that. But if they don't turn to nuclear power, which is now in a war zone, what are they going to do? So I had a Zoom call, if people know what that is.
Oh, yeah. I didn't until the pandemic, but I do now.
So face-to-face online with 4 energy activists in Ukraine the other day. And I'm trying to connect them with former Nuclear Regulatory Commission people so they can talk about what kind of regulation would be needed, what's the reliability of Westinghouse as a partner. And nobody is presenting the downside of what happened with Westinghouse. And I know the story. And these former Nuclear Regulatory Commission commissioners, one of them has just agreed to talk with the Ukrainians, Peter Bradford, and Greg Jasko, who was the head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission during the Fukushima accident
in Japan
in 2011. I've reached out to him, and he is more inclined to be a skeptic and to talk to activists, where most of the other Nuclear Regulatory Commission people, they just rubber stamp what the industry wants. So I can't tell you how it's going to turn out with what this group does in Ukraine, but it was Greenpeace, colleagues that connected me with them, because they know I'm one of the most knowledgeable people about the nuclear construction of the large nuclear power plants, which have been a failed venture so far. So there's so many threads that come together. And what is our future going to be? I don't know. Will there be a role for small reactors? That's what they're pursuing. They only exist on paper. So as I look into the future with nuclear power, coal, conservation efficiency, solar, I don't know what's going to happen, but the population is so large, it's going to be some tough sledding ahead, I think, on the energy front.
Right.
And particularly with the world population is what it is and the consumption levels. And none of our energy use or resource consumption has really been lessened that much. Is this sustainable? I don't think so. But what are we going to do? So we have a lot of complex issues to resolve, and people better get engaged in a better way than they are now. People of the means to have the luxury to be engaged. So many people are marginalized and
Sure,
don't have the
I see.
luxury to have this conversation we're having right now.
Well, you know, we're talking again. I remember growing up, again, in the 1990s, and the idea of electric cars was sort of this, you know, that's Jetsons level stuff. And there was the EV1, it was a complete failure. And then you didn't hear anything about electric cars until, you know, the Toyota Prius, which is a hybrid. And now you have it seems like an explosion of electric cars from all sorts. And it's not just startups like Tesla and Rivian and Lucid and NIO, but Ford. Ford now has an F-150 all-electric. You know, the big three automakers, if we can still call them that, have all-electric. And this has been touted as something as great progress. Yeah, I know enough about you now, Tom, to know that's probably not your perspective, but that's something that's being pitched, is if there's going to be any sort of this shift away, that everything is going to, what did President Obama call it? An all the above energy strategy back in 2012, and that I think that's still pretty much the consensus from the center of the political mainstream. Is there a role for nuclear energy? Is there a role for, how is it going to be managed, do you think?
Well, let me go back to your
Sure.
illustration of electric vehicles.
Sure.
I think that's great. And they should be pursued. But, and we were talking earlier about my impact of working with people in Europe and activists.
Yeah.
People who live in Athens, Georgia, need to be able to go to the local train station and take a fast train to Atlanta, Georgia.
The brain train.
Just
pipe
whatever,
dream.
75 miles away or whatever. My father used to ride the train from about 50 miles west of Atlanta in Rockmart, Georgia, near the Alabama line. He would ride the train to the University of Georgia around 1940.
So you're saying this isn't ancient history and it's been done before?
To some degree, but in Europe, I mean, they've cut back some of the train service, but you can go from any city to any city, and people come back impressed. And Japan, the same thing, where I've spent a good bit of time working on nuclear issues with Greenpeace Japan. And
that's sort of the gold standard for high-speed rail
Yeah,
transport.
and you've got high-speed trains, and you can go long distances. And I've taken the high-speed train from Amsterdam to Paris, or Amsterdam to Frankfurt, Germany, and on to visit friends in Germany or work in Germany. And this country doesn't have that. So yes, have electric vehicles, but we need a public transport system that is worthy of people here, and people have really no clue until they go to Europe or another country and find out that they're actually transportation systems. I mean, but they're still based on fuel. So where are you going to get that from? Or electricity? So you got to solve the problem where that's coming from. So what it's going to look like in the future, you know, small modular reactors or solar power or what, particularly in a northern country with cloudy skies, I can't answer that. But we are in a dynamic period of human history where these things have to be addressed, because resource extraction, species elimination, devastation of forest, including rainforests, is all happening at a big pace, and a lot of it's tied to energy and consumption, and we got to address it. But looking beyond, it's not just having electric vehicles, it's having a system that's built on more responsible energy use and consumption.
What do you think the impact, and this is a very broad geopolitical question, and the reason I ask is because you brought up the rainforest. What effect has there been across the world with sort of the rise of sort of what we would call the populist right, the Vladimir Putins, the Jair Bolsonaros in Brazil, on energy policy, environmental policy? We have the Paris Accords, but what challenges are there beyond sort of just disaffection or inattention or indifference from the general public? What role do elected governments around the world have in shaping public perspectives and public policy?
Well, I know some people who don't participate in the political process by not even voting. And I participate in the political process.
Right.
And I think it's urgently important that more people do. And it's very important, whether we want to recognize it or not, the role of government and government policies. But in this conversation, I haven't really mentioned that as much.
Yeah.
I've mentioned more that I think it's what the populace pushes and forces to happen and how they participate, but it's often through government. Mm-hmm. And here in 2022, when we're talking, the rise of so-called right wing, and I don't buy necessarily right wing, left wing, and I hear political commentators talking about both sides of the aisles, meaning Democrat and Republicans. Mm-hmm. As I said before, I think we have to bring in more viewpoints, but there has to be agreed dialogue at a place where we have this discussion, both politically and culturally. And that's kind of broken by some people. And it's being broken on purpose. And it's being broken to serve interests that I don't quite understand. I don't understand what, an Obama or a Trump are after. Mm. It's basically based on power and chaos. To what end? I don't know. And what does that get us collectively? More chaos, and we can't sit down and negotiate and agree with things together. And hate is driving a lot of it now, and we've got to find better ways to communicate and sit down and talk. And I think Germany is a perfect example. Mm-hmm. They have a more so-called right-leaning faction, the Christian Democrats, and
right.
the Social Democrats in the middle, and the Greens, and they've got the far left, the Die Linke, the left.
Die Linke, yeah.
So all these people come together, and I'm working now with some people in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia where there's a Christian Democrat CDU government and a Green government. And they have a certain site there has wanted to import high-level nuclear waste from a German facility to Savannah Riverside. Mm-hmm. And now the Minister of Environment and Transport in North Rhine-Westphalia, one of the biggest states,
right,
is a Green person, former member of the Bundestag, with whom I have met and communicated with over the last 10 years. He's the guy that's going to embark in making the decision. And the agreement between the Greens and the right Christian Democrats, their platform is to oppose the export of this material. But here they have a dialogue. Mm-hmm. And here we can't, in the United States and other countries, we can't even come to an agreement to sit down to talk about stuff because some forces of disruption don't want to do that. And I don't know what their real political platform is except chaos and disruption. I mean, there may be to lower taxes or whatever, and supposedly to get government out of our lives. And in fact, they really kind of want government more in our lives. Mm. Who knows how this is going to be resolved, but I do look to some European countries, particularly the Netherlands or Germany, and see that we can have dialogue that ends up at a better place, and we can develop, better policy concerning energy or nuclear issues that is more sensible than we have now.
Well, to go back to something you said earlier about your sort of affinity for or respect for a parliamentary system of government, that what you're talking about, the system being broken here in the United States, it almost seems like if what you are talking about is to come to pass, that the institutions of the United States as they're laid out, especially the United States Senate, for example, which, there's several great studies, popular and political science oriented, talking about how, with the decline of regular order and actual functioning, can anything policy-wise make it through the Senate unless there's an emergency? And it seems like if you needed a government that's responsive to emergent concerns like this, what you're saying is you have to have a system of government that can function in emergencies. or not, excuse me, you need a government that can function when it's not a crisis. And you can have debate and shift focus to meet the needs. Can that happen in the United States?
Right now, not. I think the system is more dysfunctional than it's been, and some people like it that way. But I think over the long term, I'm concerned about what's happening right now. But over the long term, I think some of these things are going to have to change and have to work out, even though I'm kind of pessimistic now. And in the long term, I would like to see that more parliamentary style. I think the Electoral College is, it's just a mess. And the 50% plus one vote control of everything, there are problems with that for me, because I'm the guy usually that ain't the 50%.
First past the post.
And, that's one reason I ran. I know you wanted to ask about this.
Yeah.
I ran for the Green Party for U.S. Senate in 2010. It was a bit of a lark, I admit, but it was to underscore that we need more representation from other viewpoints. But the media never ask about that. They never ask about, what do you think? And I would throw in, we need a parliamentary system. And the opponents in that race were a guy named Alvin Green, the Democrat, and he had no chance and didn't understand what was going on, and it was a fluke that I think he got to be their candidate.
Yeah.
And Jim DeMint, who was basically a corporate representative on the Republican side, and neither one of them would debate me. And, I ended up getting about almost 10% of the vote.
Which is quite a good showing.
And I think it may have been one of the highest totals of a Green Party or third party candidate in a national level election in the United States, and, well, God, for a long time. And part of them were disaffected Democrats who voted for me, but
Sure.
I was using that we need more representative government, and also to raise environmental issues, and particularly nuclear that I was working on, and nuclear weapons. But the media didn't really ask about those things. They wanted more to know about tax issues and health care, which I was perfectly fine talking about.
Sure.
But we don't have viable third parties in this country, and I think we need that. And I don't think a lot of these problems are going to get straightened out for a long time, but that would be a revolutionary change. Can I envisage it? Not so much with the way things are now. But in the course of human history, if this country survives, I think maybe we're going to have to go that way. And it's exactly the lesson we gave to Europe, the United States gave to Europe and Japan after World War II. And we couldn't even apply to ourselves what we basically pushed on the Germans.
There is some irony to that.
Yes, and I think, if we applied that to ourselves, but there's too much ingrained power in the two-party system. And the people I know in Europe, I can sit down with a so-called right-wing political guy over there and feel a lot of commonality, because the fact they will sit down and discuss about important issues, and they don't want to just roadblock things.
Right.
Which is the way it is here, and create enemies. And I try to sit down with Republicans, and a lot of them won't do it. They just want to view, me as an enemy rather than wanting to engage the system in dialogue. And that's got to change, and it's just very unfortunate what is happening now. But I'm looking beyond the moment, and I think things will be better. But there's a real threat of nuclear war because of what's happening in Ukraine and threats from Russia. But the United States is armed to the teeth, and its policy is to be able to fight a full-scale nuclear war. That's the policy of President Biden right now. It was the policy of all the presidents previous, that we will remain on a footing to fight a full-scale nuclear war. So that's a huge concern right now, and it's very dangerous in this political climate. As I mentioned, I have friends in Russia who've been silenced because they don't believe in any participation by public interest groups and nonprofits, particularly if they get any donations from abroad.
Sure.
So we're at, I think, a kind of a pivotal, dangerous point right now, and I hope rather than being angry and wanting to be confrontational, that people more embrace dialogue and that we have to work together. And it takes everybody doing it. So I don't really have that many answers, but it's something we have to do.
Well, is there? I don't want to necessarily leave it on a negative note, but is there anything else you'd like to record for posterity, or anything left to add? Because otherwise, I think that's a great place to.
Well, let me just mention a little bit about the nuclear power situation in my state, South Carolina.
Sure.
So the United States had a huge construction of nuclear power plants starting in the 70s and mostly in the 80s. And those reactors, a lot of them are operating. And people can debate whether that was the right thing to do or not. All the nuclear waste from them is still, the high-level nuclear waste spent fuel, still sitting at the reactors. So along comes the early 2000s, and Southern Company, Georgia Power Company, and SCANA in South Carolina,
Right.
South Carolina Electric and Gas, decide to build new reactors. 1,000-megawatt large reactors designed by Westinghouse. And in the presentation before the regulatory agency in South Carolina, the Public Service Commission, and it's also called the Public Service Commission in Georgia,
Right.
the analysis of alternatives, and I think the project was estimated at $14 billion, and they had another big partner besides South Carolina Electric and Gas. The analysis of conservation, efficiency, wind, and solar was about 3 pages out of a multi-hundred-page presentation to the South Carolina Public Service Commission to the right to proceed with the project, which was also regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which inspected the construction. So I was confronted with a situation there where there was no review of alternatives. It just invests billions of dollars into a new design reactor, never built anywhere, existed only on paper. There was no construction companies that had really been able to do this for a couple of decades. And we intervened, and at that point I had come back working in Colombia, South America, with a human rights group called Peace Brigades International, because I needed a change of pace, escorting public interest groups down there in all sorts of dicey situations to protect, their human rights. And it's an ongoing mess down there with the, revolutionary groups and terrorist groups that have killed a lot of people. Anyway, I came back to Columbia, South Carolina, when part of my charge was to analyze an intervention against the nuclear reactor project. And I realized they had done no analysis on alternatives. And they had no ability to build the project because they were a very small utility versus the size of Southern Company and Georgia Power, which is continued. So what happened? We intervened on a continuous basis, and I was Friends of the Earth, then Sierra Club, and then Friends of the Earth again. So the project was so poorly mismanaged, so much money was wasted, the design was questionable, and Westinghouse went bankrupt in 2017. Then the project in South Carolina fell apart. The ratepayers for South Carolina Electric and Gas and a publicly owned entity called Santee Cooper, which is electric cooperatives, $11 billion was wasted on construction. And it was like, we told you so. You didn't analyze the alternatives. You rushed into this without enough capital backing it, without companies that could do the construction, and it fell apart. And we're going to be saddled with the cost for 20 years after the project was killed. All the financing costs are going to get saddled to the ratepayers. For what? For zero energy. And we told them from day one in all the proceedings before the Public Service Commission, you need to get them to analyze alternatives. It was a joke. And that's what happened with Georgia Power. And now these reactors are like $35 billion. So they may operate, they may generate electricity. There could be some technical problems, but it's going to be some of the most expensive electricity ever produced. But they're going to mix those new reactors in with all the other generating sources and some conservation and efficiency. So the true cost will be diluted. But I was one of the principal ones raising questions. And people in South Carolina know that it was a huge mistake. And the South Carolina legislature investigated it, where there's been no investigations in Georgia. There's been no investigations on the national level. So what's the difference? The difference is Georgia Power didn't go bankrupt. South Carolina Electric and Gas, part of the SCANA Corporation, went bankrupt. And the shareholders really got creamed. They got really hit, and the ratepayers got hit. We had 9 rate hikes. They're still in the rate base in South Carolina. In Georgia, you at least in Georgia have the amount of the nuclear charges on the bill. We never had that, and we don't have it now. And 2.5% to 3% of our bill is going for a nuclear project that never got built. It was a huge mistake, even if you're pro-nuclear. And what were the results? Because of the failed project in South Carolina, and really it failed in Georgia, although it's continuing, they killed nuclear power. They killed the revival of nuclear power in the United States, of large reactors. So people look at me as like, you stop nuclear power. No, the nuclear industry stopped nuclear power, large reactors. So now they're pursuing smaller ones, which exist only on paper and rely on handouts from the U.S. Department of Energy. So what does this say for the future of energy? It's a big lesson, and I can't tell how it's going to play out, but it has stopped these huge reactors from being built because construction companies can't build them. So there's a lot of threads that need to be pulled out, and there hasn't been enough examination of this. And in Georgia, there's not an examination. And now Westinghouse, as I said, wants to move to Ukraine. There's been no review in Ukraine of what happened in Georgia and South Carolina. There has to be. And so I wanted to comment on that, where that leaves a big unknown looking into the future, and a positive, just like I think on the political front, is it's forced an analysis as we look to what happens with nuclear power, what happens with energy generation, what happens with the nuclear waste that's generated, and we still have no disposal facility for high-level nuclear waste. But I look at all these things that are kind of negative, is they present an opportunity for coming up with some positive answers, and they all inform decisions that are going to be made. And I feel kind of proud of having been involved in some of these questions. And we internationally, we've stopped separation of plutonium because we focused on something with Greenpeace. And we forced a discussion about what happens with nuclear power, and therefore all of energy. And I think that's a real positive, though in the short term, there's a lot of downside negatives of costs, and the nuclear waste is there. So a positive note on that front is we're having the discussion about what happens with our energy future. I don't have a crystal ball, but there's a lot that's going to inform the decision making in the future based on what's happening right now, and it's all, the groundwork for that is all there in a positive way, I think. So.
Well, we're talking here now, August 5th, and I think a lot of political pundits and experts. There's going to be a vote in the United States Senate on a sort of omnibus bill that funds some of the climate change initiatives at least within the Democratic Party, and I think most political pundits didn't think that would materialize before the midterm elections in 22, when the Democrats are, again, August 5th, projected to lose power in 2023. So, like you said, there are developments and things that sometimes are surprising, even to experts in the field.
Well, I think some of that, and I don't agree with a lot of the political package and where the money is being sent, because I think we need the national public transport that's not really being addressed. But the political tide, the cultural tide, the social tide is too great to ignore. So in the case of this one bill, it's come back because there is a collective mindset of we have a lot of problems on the environment front, the energy front, and the political front. And unless we have a total breakdown, I think this stuff is going to have to be, it's going to come out at every iteration, and people are not going to just let it sit, even though there's some that want to ignore it and exploit it. I still think the forces of engagement and positivity on solving issues, and I don't necessarily think it's in Congress, but that's a big part of it. It's on the state level too, that you can't stop it. It's way bigger than all of us, and it's a collective thing, and that's it's way bigger than me as I step back from the scene and retirement. This discussion is going to continue, and I'm kind of negative in a lot of ways, but this is one area where I feel over the longer term, the collective force is going to yield some positive results.
Well, to quote Chuck Todd, we'll have to leave it there. Tom, thank you so much. Tom Clements has donated his papers to the Richard B. Russell Library here at the University of Georgia. Once those are processed, they'll be open for research. And sir, thank you again for making the drive over here and taking the time to talk about your experiences and your insights.
Ashton and Robert and Cheryl, thank you very much. I really appreciate what you guys are doing at the archives and archiving a little bit of political and social activism in Georgia and beyond. It's very important, so thank you.
No, thank you very much.